continue our Heroes of the Faith sermon series. This will again lead us up until Advent. And I think the last sermon in this particular series is going to be about Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. So we may have to edit a couple out or put a couple together between now and then to make that happen. But we'll get there. Last week we began where all good stories begin, which is in the chapter before. Most stories don't actually start there in chapter 11. The stories start before, so we went backwards to chapter 10 a little bit. And we saw there that it's essential for every believer to understand the nature of enduring faith. You know, there's a type of faith that does not endure trials and temptations. It's mentioned in the parable of the four soils from Luke chapter 8, verses 11 through 15. There's seed that's sown on the rocky ground that springs up quickly, but it also quickly withers and dies. So it wasn't very much of a faith at all. And then there's a faith that's like the seed that it lands on the thorny ground, lasts a little bit longer, but eventually it's strangled out by the temptations and worries and riches and the pleasures of this life. So it's not a very long lasting, it's not a very enduring faith. Neither type of faith that is shown there is brought forth to maturity. It doesn't bear fruit. Only the seed that lands on the good ground bears fruit through perseverance. And that parable, I think, serves as a useful background to our text last week when we looked at what Habakkuk would say, and my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. He expresses confidence in his readers in verse 39. The Hebrew writer says, but we do not belong to those who shrink back. We have an enduring faith. Some of his readers were in danger of shrinking back. I mean, they're going through real trials. They're going through real temptations. They are being killed. They are being pulled out of their houses and stoned to death. And so they have a worldview of like, if I hold on, if I cling to Christianity, it may cost me my very life. But the writer says in verse 12 of this chapter, he says, imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promise. Those who imitate what we're about to study in chapter 11, those who have that type of enduring faith, those are the ones who inherit the promises of God. When we get into this chapter a little bit deeper, when we look at the devotees in chapter 11, we're going to see that they are going to do things by faith. By faith, so-and-so did this. By faith, such and such did that. By faith, so-and-so did this. So we're going to be looking at by faith today. And to that end, the Hebrew writer devotes chapter 11 to an explanation, an illustration of genuine faith that endures. He's not focusing on the aspect of justification by faith, though he does that in other parts. In this particular chapter, he's talking about the operation, the outworking of being justified by faith. He's saying this is what your faith is going to look like. This is what it's going to look like in you. You're going to have this kind of faith. It's going to operate in you, and it's going to look outward into the world. And that's what the Hebrew writer is about to tell us. This is a type of faith that's going to lay hold of God's promises. This is the kind of faith that's going to look at the reality of the unseen world. And it's the kind of faith that's going to obediently apply those realities in present trials. Faith, as we're going to look at this morning, is the means of realizing spiritual reality, the means of gaining God's approval, and the means of understanding the origin of all that is. But before we look at those different aspects of faith, I think it might be helpful to explain about the nature of faith with reference to relationships. And what I'm about to say is probably obvious to all of us. It's one of those, well, duh, but still we need to hear it. We need to hear it over and over again. There are principles in relationships. There are principles that come to mind in personal relationships. The first one is trust. Trust is essential for close personal relationships. If you don't trust someone, you're not going to allow yourself to get close to that person. You're also not going to allow that person to get close to you. You're not going to share personal information because you're afraid that that person might use it against you in a way that would damage you. And you're not going to believe the personal information that they give you because you're afraid that they're trying to pull one over on you. A second principle when it comes to relationships is that truth is the basis for trust. If I tell you something and it proves to be true, you gain a little bit of trust from me. If you tell me something and it proves out to be true, I gain a little trust for you. Truth is essential in the foundation of trusting someone. We all have believed the lie, haven't we? Even Eve believed the lie. Way back in the garden, Adam believed the lie. God doesn't want you to eat this because he knows you'll be like him. You will be God. We've all believed the lie. But our personal relationship, especially with one another, and most importantly, our relationship with God, is based on truth. We trust that God is telling us the truth. And then the third thing in this relationship is that truth must be expressed in love. We've all seen Chris Farley ask, "Hey, does this jacket make me look fat?" No, Chris, your fat makes you look fat. The jacket just enhances that. We could say that and say that meanly, but God tells us when we teach one another, when we speak to one another, speak the truth in love. It means we're not to tell them a lie. Does this dress make me look fat? Well, that's the one that you're always going to lie about, gentlemen. Of course not, sweetheart. You look perfect. Why did we get asked that question, man? Why do they ask us that question? That's a totally different sermon. Sorry. Truth must be expressed in love. It doesn't do me any good to yell and shout the truth at you if I'm not doing it to build you up. And that's what when we talk about love, we're talking about that agape. We're talking about building one another up. The words that I'm saying are for your betterment, to draw you closer to God, to make you a more complete and whole person. So when we're looking at relationships, we need to look at trust, we need to look at truth, and we need to look at love. And you're going to ask yourself, man, I thought we were talking about faith. I thought this series was about faith. I didn't think it was about personal relationships. But I want to tell you that these elements of relationship apply pertinently. I mean, they're urgent in our relationship with God. Because you see, faith or our trust in God is the foundation of a relationship with Him. Without faith, as the Hebrew writer is going to tell us in just a few verses, it's impossible to please God. The thing that we looked at with John in our series of 1 John, the thing that we look at here in the Hebrew writer, what the Hebrew writer says, is that we are calling God a liar if we don't trust Him. We're saying, God, there's no way you can save us. God, there's no way you created. There's no way that Jesus was born. There's no way you do. We're calling Him a liar when we don't trust Him. Whether we mean to or not, that's what we're saying to Him. And truth is the basis for trust. If you doubt the truth of God's word, including His promises for the future, you cannot trust Him. And the result is that you'll be distant from Him. You will not have a close personal relationship with Him. And understanding these principles leads us to this thought. Sometimes the things that God says aren't easy to accept or easy to understand. When He sends difficult trials into our lives, when He confronts our unbelief, when He confronts our sin, when some of us are persecuted to the point of death, when we lose our health, when we lose our wealth, when we lose those that are close to us, we have to trust Him, believing that He is acting in love from Christ toward us. If the enemy can get us to doubt God's love in times of trials, we will draw away from God and disobey his word of truth. To draw near to God, we must believe that he exists. Chapter 11, verse 6 continues this way. We must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So as we keep these principles in mind, I want to move forward into the lesson. Let's look at verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11. Let's read that together. Faith is confidence in what we hope and assurance about what we do not see. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it may be one of those verses that's hard to comprehend because depending on what version you read will be dependent on what kind of words that you see in there. And we understand that in chapter 1, we're going to be realizing a spiritual reality. Now, some of the words that we read in there depends on how we look at them. If we look at them as subjective or objective. Now, the NIV will say confidence and assurance. The New English Standard will say being sure and being convinced. The New American Standard will say assurance and conviction. The King James Version says substance and evidence. So when we look at these words, I need to define these words because the English language doesn't do a very good job of it. And also, I can look at these words two different ways. Subjectively means, oh, how do I see it? How does, let's say I picked up a rock and hit Jim in the head with it. And then I'm going to go look at that rock. Well, that's just a rock. Jim's going to see that rock a little bit differently, isn't he? Because he has a personal experience with that rock. It's just hit him in the head. So Jim's not going to look at that rock and say, oh man, look at the granules in that and look at that. I wonder what it looks like if we break it open. He's going to say, that stinking thing hurt. When we look at it objectively, we say, well, that is a nice rock. It has a nice shape and it's got a pretty good weight to it. And look at the crystal grains. Looking at things from the outside, we don't take our personal feelings and put them into that particular story. And so when we look at this particular thing about faith, we have to look at it, I think, objectively. And so I think the Hebrew writer is saying, while your faith is personal and it is subjective to you, and we all have different experiences with faith, as we're going to study out, and as we look at these Old Testament characters, they all had different experiences and different levels of faith. I want you to look objectively and define what it is here. So when he says, what I like to read, when he talks about understanding, he's saying that faith means being confident of what we hope for, convinced of what we do not see. Confident of what we hope for, convinced of what we do not see. Faith is the reality of goods hoped for. We are hoping for homes in heaven. That is our hope. Do we see it? Can we touch it? Can we smell it? No. We live by faith and not by sight. And so when we hear God tell us through Jesus, I have a home prepared for you, we believe it. We trust that it's there. I am putting my hope on the reality of what's coming and the proof of things unseen. Can anybody see demons? If you can, and you're in touch with the spiritual realm, and I shudder to think what your world looks like. How about angels? How about God? Oh, we see the results of some of the actions in the spiritual world, but are we able to see them? We believe and are confident the reality of the goods hoped for, that God is real, that Jesus Christ is real, that the Holy Spirit is real. They're not something that we make up in a comic book. They're not some fantasy story that we read about, that there is a reality there, and we place our trust in that reality. Even though we can't see it, we put our faith in it. From the examples that are going to be coming later in the chapter, it's going to be clear that what is not primarily in view is what we feel or we possess. We own, we have assurance, we have confidence in salvation. Our faith gives it substance. Our faith makes it real. to us. It's already real. God's created it. God is there. God exists. Spirit exists. Our salvation exists. And we believe that it's real. A.W. Pink says this. He uses an analogy. He talks about two men standing on the deck of a lighthouse looking out into the ocean. One sees a freighter way off, and another man doesn't. And they're both standing at the same area, both looking in the same direction. The one who doesn't see it is the one who's just standing there with his naked eye looking out, trying to see it. The one who can see the freighter out there is the one who has a telescope. And he sees the things that are far off. Our faith is like a telescope. We see those things far off. They are reality. Before we leave verse 1, I want to allude to something that our writer is going to talk about in verse 34. He's talking about illustrating an illustration of how faith worked in the lives of three Hebrew young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Over in Daniel 3, verse 34 says that some were quenched the power of fire. I think that's referring back to this story. You see, if you remember the story, they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. They refused to bow down to his idol, which caused the offended king to threaten to throw them into the blazing furnace. Their response shows that by faith they were making real in the present crisis the future promises of God. I'll illustrate by this what they say. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They said, "We believe in the God that's out here. We believe that this God is going to rescue us in this moment. We trust him. And even if we're not saved from this fire, we're still going to trust him. Because in the end, he will save our souls eternally." As we move into verse 2, we're going to see that faith is the means of gaining God's approval. He says, "For by it," this is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, the ancients were commended. Now, when we talk about the ancients, he's going to talk about them a little bit further. Those who are commended for faith in verse 4, 5, 6, 39, other verses in there, they're commended for their faith. When he talks about the ancients here, he's talking about a possibility of three different groups of people. He can be talking about the ancients. You know, when you're a young person, you call anybody that's over 40 ancient. So it could be those who are older than you. In the context, he's talked about elders as well, or he will be talking about them, those who have authority in the church. But in this context, he's going to be talking about the forefathers. Now, how do I know that? Because I just need to read the next few verses, and he starts talking about those who were of ancient time, those who are forefathers, faith of our fathers. It wasn't by coincidence that we sang that song this morning. When the Hebrew writer is writing to these Jewish people, they are recalling these stories of who these people were. When we ourselves sit here on Sunday mornings, sometimes we reminisce and we think about the people who came before us, our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our uncles, people who came before us to lead us to this faith. And whether it was not your physical family that brought you here, whether it was somebody outside the church, maybe your family grew up not believing in any of this. And someone from in the church was kind enough to bring you in, and that now is your spiritual mother or father, your spiritual brother. So they are your forefathers. And I think that's who the Hebrew writer is talking about here. He's talking about the forefathers. Paul will say in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6, that all these things, that these people and these writings have been preserved because these are things that occurred as examples to us. You want an example of enduring faith? Well, first of all, let me tell you what faith is. This is what faith is. It's that assurance. It's knowing that it's there. Oh, and now, by the way, let me tell you about some people who had it. And when we look at through this list, there are going to be some people that jump out at us, and we're going to say, that guy, that girl, wait a minute, they were lovers of self. When you look at Jacob, and when you look at Abraham, and when you look at others, they were selfish. They failed miserably in the area of honesty. Moses, who's going to be mentioned, flunked the speech class. He didn't do very well in the temper department either. King David failed to keep his sexual purity. No, when we read through the Old Testament, you don't find too many persons who receive straight A's when it comes to report cards of their lives. But what you do find are their failures and their flaws. And more than that, you find why they're commended. Why are they commended? Not for perfect character, but for their faith. I look around this room, and you've looked around many rooms before, and you know that there are people there who love God. Are they perfect? No, they are not. But they have that characteristic of an enduring faith. And that's what the Hebrew writer is about ready to spill on. Faith is the means of realizing the spiritual reality that those things that we cannot see are real. It's about gaining God's approval. When God looks at all these characters who were flawed, he looks at them and he said, consider my so-and-so, look at his faith. David was a man who pursued God's own heart. He was beloved by God, and yet look at his life. When you look at Job, he tells the devil, have you considered my servant, my faithful servant, Job? Men, women, people, that their character was flawed, but God found their faith to be pleasing and commended them for it. And then the last part here in verse 3, he'll say that faith is the means of understanding the origin of all that exists. Read with me verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. This is the first of the 19 times in this chapter he's going to use by faith. All the others refer to a parade of characters from the Old Testament, people who trusted in God. But this first one goes back to Genesis chapter 1, to the biblical account of creation. And the Word of God here does not refer to his written word, but rather his spoken word. It refers to the repeated phrase, then God said, then God said, then God said. We see it in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, 6, 9, 11, 14, 20, 24, and 26. Then God said, and things became reality. Those things that he spoke, those things that he thought became reality. Psalm 33, verses 6 and 9 say this, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and the breath of his mouth all their host. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. That word universe there, a word ages, some may have the word worlds. But it's a Hebrew way of referring to creation from the standpoint of things being done in successive duration. And while the term is roughly equivalent to world, it allows for what modern science has established, that time is related to matter. When we look at day 1, day 2, it was then that God created what we know as time. God put time and matter together. The Hebrew writer says that faith gives understanding of how the material universe came into being, namely that God spoke and it became reality. And when we look at that, we see that matter is not eternal. I mean, we look at our building, we have to paint, we have to redecorate, chairs, carpet, new air conditioners, new light bulbs. I mean, look at the clothes that we're wearing. they'll wear out eventually. So matter, these things are made of material matter. They're not eternal. But look at what is eternal. God, who is spirit, is eternal. And so the eternal God brought physical matter and time into being by his powerful word alone. Now, I want to tell you, if somebody demonstrates that they have that kind of power, I want to follow them. I don't understand how scientists today can look at a strand of what we know as DNA and not bow down and say there is a God. Because when you look at the order that's brought out of the chaos of the world, I'm supposed to believe that this DNA strand that has paired chromosomes, that spirals around, that has the genetic imprint of everything that I physically look like, I'm supposed to believe that just happened. It takes more faith to believe in that than just to believe in the workings of God. Because you're believing it that from chaos comes order on its own. I know we've all used the illustration before or heard it, that you throw a bunch of monkeys in a room with typewriters, leave them in there for 14 hours, and then out comes the Bible or any book. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You can't, anybody ever play with Legos? You can't just take that box of Legos, shake it up, throw it out in the air, and rumble them all together, and it builds itself. It doesn't happen that way. The unseen God put time and matter together and made reality, made our reality. There's abundant evidence. I missed a paragraph there. There's abundant evidence that an incredibly intelligent designer created everything. And so we don't operate as Christians from a blind faith. Paul says it this way in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 and 22. Why do people not believe in God? Because they don't want to. Sinful men suppress the truth in unrighteousness, he'll say. They become futile in their speculations. Their foolish hearts are darkened, and they profess to be wise, but in actuality, they become fools. I think we're talking about that in our Wednesday night class, aren't we? Where wisdom begins and where foolishness begins. The fact that the author puts verse 3 at the start of his list, he says, by faith, shows that faith in God as creator is foundational in knowing God. You want to know where to start in your belief of God? Believe that he created. Believe that he created all that there is and all that there ever will be. That he created the universes. Not universes, pardon me. Too many comic books, they have multiverses. God created the universe. As far as I know, there's only one, and he created it. If there are multi-universes, then God created them too. But I don't think there's a multiverse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Basic foundation of our faith is trusting and believing that, seeing the unseen, trusting that God has done what he says he's done. And then the Hebrew writer is going to parade a bunch of people across the stage and say, this guy believed from the beginning that God created everything. And this guy believed from the beginning that God created everything. And this guy and this woman, they began to believe that God created everything, that God is the beginning of existence for man. And they make that reality. Though they can't see it, they objectively look at the evidence and say, there is a God, and he created these things. The first verse of Genesis presents us with a crucial choice. If God created everything that is, then He is sovereign over the universe. I believe that that is the truth. And I trust God with that, because when I look at His words, He has spoken to me in love, because He wants that relationship. And relationships begin with trust. They begin with the truth. They begin speaking truth in love. And God has met all that criteria. If you don't come to Him in faith as your Savior, you're going to stand before Him in terror as your judge. But when you believe who He is, when you believe His word about salvation, when you believe who Jesus is, and you believe that salvation comes through Him, you gain understanding about the origins of the ages, the origins of the worlds, the origin of time, the origin of all matter, the origin of our faith. Believing who God is and what He's done. The author, as I get ready to close, the author doesn't want us to have a temporary, flimsy faith that shrinks back to destruction. He wants us to have a faith that endures trials, endures it to the persevering. Oops, sorry, went too far. He wants us to have faith that endures trials to the preserving of the soul, chapter 10, verse 39. Such faith takes the future promises of God, makes them real in the present. It proves the reality of the unseen world. It gains God's approval. It understands the origins of all that is. Such faith, as we're going to see numerous times, is down to earth. It's practical. It sustained the people of God through thousands of years in every sort of difficulty. It will sustain you in the trials that you face now. Jonathan Edwards said this on his deathbed: trust in God and you do not need, trust in God and you need not fear. As we look at these heroes of faith, we're going to see that they were unafraid of death. They were unashamedly faithful believers in God, who He is, and what He's done. I hope and pray that as we go through this, your faith will grow, that you will have an assurance of things that are real waiting for us, that are real now. We have salvation now, and one day we'll see it in heaven with God, our Father, Christ, our King, and the Spirit, the guarantee seal that lives inside of us. I long for that day. I hope you do as well. We're going to sing a song as we dismiss. If you will, go ahead and be standing. We're going to sing song number 57 in your songbooks. Great is thy faithfulness.